Good evening. Welcome to tonight's event. And for those attending in person, congratulations on finding your way here through the construction. Before we turn to the main event, I'd like to announce our next and the last event of the year, in which Professor Catherine Judd of the English department will discuss her new book, Travel Narratives of the Irish Famine, Politics, Tourism, and Scandal, 1845 to 1853. Her talk will be on Wednesday, May 4th on Zoom. Please note that instead of being at 8 o'clock, as book talks normally are, it will be at 6. Now let me turn to tonight's event, the annual Edith Blythe Lecture. This speaker series is dedicated to the memory of one of the University of Miami's earliest and most devoted students. Edith Blythe began part-time study at the university in 1926, the very first year of its existence. She was the first of her immigrant family to attend college, and she was the first to earn a degree, which she accomplished in 1939. By then, she had begun a legendary career, which lasted more than 50 years as a beloved teacher in the public schools of Miami and Miami Beach. Through a life of nearly 103 years, Edith spoke often of her pride at having been a local pioneer, and we remember her today for her devotion to the university and the city she never ceased to love. And I'll note that this series was funded by a generous donation from her nephew, Stuart Blumen. To introduce tonight's speaker, I will turn the podium over to my colleague, Professor Susanna Ayes-Toron of the Department of Modern Languages and Literature.
Well, thank you very much to all of you for being here in person and via Zoom. Welcome, everyone. It is my pleasure today to introduce José Salicrú Illuc, Senior Researcher at the Spanish National Research Council in Barcelona since 2000. Tonight, we are hosting one of the most well-established and recognized medievalists in Spain, and one of the biggest specialists on the Crown of Aragon. Among her many titles and achievements, I can mention that José is tenure academic at the Institute of Catalan Studies since 2017, that she has directed for 10 years the journal Anuario de Estudios Medievales, one of the top journals in Spain. She has directed 13 doctoral theses in the last 10 years. And last year, she was invited as visiting associate professor at the University of Chicago. But guess what? Unfortunately, it was postponed because of the COVID, right? I met José in 2012 when I was a postdoc at her institution. Her office was 2 doors away from mine, and it became a habit for me to stop by almost every day. At that time, I was collaborating with a project that was building an online dictionary of medieval Latin in the Crown of Aragon. And honestly, to say the truth, I felt a little bit envious because José was always studying, always was working on topics much cooler than mine. But, you know, although those feelings, we remain friends. So her primary focus in medieval Mediterranean is medieval Mediterranean history. She has been interested mainly in the context between Christianity and Islam in the Iberian context, and in the Western Mediterranean in the late Middle Ages, paying special attention to the ancient Crown of Aragon. In recent years, she has been very productive, I would say, in 3 different lines of research. First, trading, navigation, and shipbuilding in the medieval Mediterranean world. Second, traveling and travelers in the Mediterranean Middle Ages. And third, medieval slavery during the 14th and 15th centuries in the Mediterranean. One of the last edited volumes is precisely titled To Be and Live as an Enslaved, Identity, Acculturation, and Agency, Mediterranean and Atlantic World from 13th to 18th century, published by La Casa de Velázquez. José has a truly extensive an impressive list of publications. Since 1995, she has published 8 books. She has 9 edited books, and wait for it. She has 105 chapter books, plus 39 articles in peer-reviewed journals. Some of these work have been published in the Amsterdam University Press, Brepols, Brill, La Casa de Velázquez, Istituto Storico Italiano per il Medioevo, Picard, among many others. To date, she has directed 7 national and international funded research projects. Since 2009, she is the PI of a project recognized and funded by the Catalan government under the title The Crown of Aragon, Islam and the Mediterranean World. She has another project funded by the Spanish government, Movement and Mobility in the Mediterranean, in the medieval Mediterranean, People, Terms and Concepts. And now, together with Frederic Bouden from the University of Liège in Belgium, she has been awarded a new project entitled A Connected History of Medieval Mediterranean Diplomacy, the Mamluk Sultanate, Italy, and the Crown of Aragon, 14th and 15th century. I could go on, but I will stop here. Thank you very much, Luce, for being here with us and share your research with all of us. But let me finish this brief introduction by thanking the Center for the Humanities. Thank you, Hugh. Thank you, Oni. Thank you, Christina, and for making this possible and for creating a space, a welcoming space for the humanities. Thank you very much for all your hard work. So, yeah.
Well, good evening. First of all, thank you to the Center for the Humanities for, especially to his director, Professor Hugh Thomas. Thanks as well to my, I think it's clear, my friend, anyway, Susana Ares. And I am really glad to be here. I was supposed to come last year, but unfortunately, because of COVID, because of the pandemic, it wasn't possible. But I am here, very happy to be here, and I welcome you all. So the title of my lecture is How Did Christians and Muslims Communicate in the Medieval Mediterranean? An approach from the Crown of Aragon. A considerable number of scholarships have been devoted to the close interactions and the influences between the Christian and Islamic shores of the Western medieval Mediterranean. However, it seems that when discussing the matter, it is the negative aspects of the context between Christians and Muslims that first come in mind, including war, piracy, captivity, and slavery. Nevertheless, in the medieval Mediterranean, Christians and Muslims and Christian and Islamic powers also regularly interacted in a positive way, mainly through trade and diplomacy, and both over the maritime and the terrestrial frontiers. Therefore, despite their religious, cultural, and linguistic differences, and their theoretical ideological divide, and even though we may consider them worlds apart, Christians and Muslims stayed in touch and needed to communicate and interact for both positive and negative reasons. Close inspection to the negative evidences, named piracy, piratic attacks, or the seizure of people, may in fact turn out to be valuable examples of positive context, such as mercantile relations. In the study of any kind of boundary and any type of relationship between disparate realities, and consequently between Christians and Muslims in the late medieval Mediterranean, what often defines the nature of contexts that come to light may owe more to the wishes of the researcher and to the objectives he or she is pursuing when questioning, interpreting, and weighing up the sources than to the sources themselves. In other words, seeing the bottle half full or half empty depends almost always on the point of view an individual or a scholar has taken. In spite of the supposed hostility, both the maritime and the terrestrial frontiers were permeable a space of interaction, interculturality, and hybridization to a degree that historians have often been unable to appreciate when focused on war, hostilities, and its diplomatic maneuvers. But it is precisely in diplomacy where we can observe some of the clearest cases of interchanges produced by centuries of contact. On both the diplomatic and the human spheres, we can speak of osmosis, symbiosis, or even syncretism. The question is, anyway, how and to what extent Christians and Muslims communicated and understood each other in different circumstances and situations from a linguistic and also from an intercultural point of view, and also to what extent they knew and respected each other and were able to coexist despite the ideological divide. Answers are not always unequivocal and not always the same, of course. Furthermore, we often do not have clear answers for the medieval times. However, when we pay attention to the sources and to the actors and agents that were in contact and were guaranteed the communication, we can get a glimpse of the situation. The geographical proximity of the Crown of Aragon, that is the lands of Catalonia, Valencia, and Majorca on the eastern coast of Iberia, to the western medieval Mediterranean Islam, the Nasrid Granada in the southern Iberian Peninsula and Islamic North Africa, meant and implied intense interactions between people and political powers of both worlds. In addition, the kings of the Crown of Aragon had subjects of Islamic religion and speakers of Arabic language, the Mudejars, the free Muslims who remained in their lands after the Christian conquest of the 13th century, who under Christian rule had been recognized the right to keep their own religion, language, and former institutional organization. As a consequence, in the Crown of Aragon, these historical conditions led to a significant degree of interaction. At the same time, the preservation of an enormous amount of archival sources makes the Crown of Aragon a privileged object for analysis at different levels of the forms of communication and interaction between the Islamic and Christian worlds in the Middle Ages. On the one hand, it is the diplomatic level and its different manifestations, both oral and written. On the other hand, there is a more human, personal, or individual perspective, that of ambassadors, frontier officers and civil servants, merchants, pirates, captives, and slaves at an oral level, which is not always evident, but can often be perceived indirectly. This way, the example of the Crown of Aragon becomes an excellent viewpoint in comparison to other areas, people, situation, and circumstances representing Mediterranean powers that have been less successful with historical sources preservation. Nevertheless, we have to bear in mind that the intensity of the Crown of Aragon's contacts with the Islamic powers is unique. Firstly, This is exactly because of its geographical proximity to the Nasrid kingdom of Granada and the North African powers of Fez, Tlemcen, and Tunisia, which differentiated the Crown of Aragon from other Mediterranean Christian powers, such as the Italian republics of Genoa, Florence, and Venetia, for instance, that as a consequence of the greater distance from Islamic lands, maintain less intensive or quotidian contacts with Muslims. Secondly, the position of the Crown of Aragon is specific because of the continual maritime and mercantile exchanges with Islamic lands, which differentiated it from Castile. Castile concentrated its efforts essentially on the terrestrial frontier fight with Granada. Finally, because of the importance of its Mudejars subjects, the Muslims living under Christian rule, Arabic speakers, among which, especially in the area and the city of Valencia, several families constituted an economic and social elite close to the Christian monarchic power and to the Christian institutions. In contrast to the Castilian and Portuguese Mudejars, Valencian Mudejars were deeply involved in trade with Western Mediterranean Islamic lands. Consequently, they often operated together with Christian Valencian merchants, not only freighting their vessels, but even sharing traffics, commercial companies, and vessels with them. Although communication can be considered quite a tricky concept and be interpreted or understood in several ways, my lecture will present different manifestations of oral and written communication between Christians and Muslims. I will summarize some of my already published and under press essays, together with some of my works in progress. Therefore, some of the illustrative examples I will provide are already known, but they allow reflecting on different levels of communication that I have been able to identify due to my knowledge of the sources of the Crown of Aragon. These sources will be complemented in a comparative way with examples taken from other areas and sources. Whereas a scholarship has undertaken extensive research on the effective results, that is, truces and treaties of diplomatic relationships between Christian and Muslim powers, it has not specifically dealt with the ways in which diplomatic agents and Christian and Muslim rulers were able to communicate and to understand each other, and hardly any attention has been paid to the nature and the identities of the people who made these contacts possible. In his 15th century account of his pilgrimage to the Holy Land, Anselmo Adorno, a Flemish merchant of Genoese stock, stated that a good interpreter or guide needed three fundamental characteristics. One, good linguistic skills. Two, experience of the way of life of the country or a knowledge of the cultural codes of the two parties he was putting in contact in order to be able to do the cultural translation as well as the linguistic one. And last but not least, faithfulness and loyalty to the person he represented. Adorno's practical approach to interpreters and guides in Islamic lands is relevant to try to establish the resources and mechanisms that diplomatic agents use to communicate and make themselves understood, and what linguistic and cultural skills they needed to guarantee that, regardless if it was oral in nature or a translation, to guarantee the communication, regardless if it was oral in nature or a translation or interpretation of a written letter or document. Indeed, together with their knowledge of the other and their linguistic skills, the loyalty, trustworthiness, and commitment of the diplomatic agents were completely imperative. In order to be successful, the missions entrusted to them required a mixture and a balance between knowledge and confidence. This was the reason for the careful choice of the diplomatic agents dealing with Islam. Thanks to the aforesaid intensity of the interactions of the Crown of Aragon with Muslim people and powers, the Catalan-Aragonese diplomatic agents appointed for Islamic lands were very often cross-cultural characters, or at least people used to deal with Muslims, such as members of the Mudejars elites of Valencia, Christian officers with posts on the frontier with Islam, mercenaries serving the Muslim rulers, and Christian merchants living or having business in Islamic lands. As a consequence, Catalan-Aragonese ambassadors did not have to be admonished how to behave before Muslim authorities, nor to be warned that the nature, habits, and modes of speech of a Muslim monarch were entirely different from a Christian one. On the contrary, in 1479, Pietro Fieschi, ambassador to Granada on behalf of the Republic of Genoa, who had never dealt with Muslims and was ignorant of Granadan ways, need to receive these precise instructions. Firstly, and before all, you have to meet in Granada the Genoese merchants who live there, and with them who have experience of the country and also of the habits and manners of that king, and also of the ways those who surround him act, you will consider together what needs to be done. These things seems very necessary because doing otherwise will mean you will be acting blindly. Moreover, we think that you have to apply a great dexterity and wit when dealing with a king and not behave in the same way as if he was a Christian king, because the nature and customs of the Muslims and the way they use the language are very different from ours. And as a consequence, it is necessary to be aware of this and to be informed by these merchants who must be used to all that. The acquisition of a good mastery of language that in the main might facilitate communication with Muslims, and the mastery of Arabic in particular, was not within everyone's grasp. Those who acted as linguistic mediators and at the same time as cultural mediators were usually a part in one way or another of the reality of the frontier or from areas where people speaking different languages lived. The frontier lands were the natural home of interpreters and translators, especially, of course, those who belong to ethnic, religious, and/or cultural minorities placed within other realities like the Jews or the Catalan Aragonese Mudejars. For the individuals, the lack of linguistic skills could entail real side effects. The Egyptian traveler Abd al-Basit tells of an example in Tunis at the beginning of the 15th century. Following the arrival of a Christian ship loaded with Muslim captives, all of them were ransomed except one. The captive turned out to be a good Muslim of Turkish stock, originally from Astrakhan, who spoke Turkish and had mastered to perfection the language of France, that is to say, a Romance language, since he had been captive in Christian lands for over 25 years. But as he knew not a single word of Arabic Upon being interrogated, he was unable to make himself understood and was taken, therefore, for a Christian. As a consequence of the Crown of Aragon's maritime frontier with Western Islam, the capture and enslavement of Muslims all over the kingdom were regular and continual, as was the seizure of Catalan-Aragonese Christian subjects by Muslims and their captivity in Islamic lands. At their arrival in Catalan-Aragonese lands, Muslim captives were interrogated by royal officers in order to establish whether they had been legally captured and could be therefore legally enslaved. Unless they had been previously enslaved in Christian lands and learned a Romance language, like the above mentioned Turkish, the Muslim captives couldn't communicate with Christian authorities because they only spoke Arabic. For the reason, they were interrogated by an interpreter. In only 10 years of the first half of the 15th century Valencia, I have been able to find the names of 25 interpreters. The majority of them were Muslims, representatives of the most important and well-known families of the Moorish quarter of Valencia, many of them merchants. Of course, as I said before, as part of the Mudejar elite, they were very well related to the crown, and consequently, the authorities considered them absolutely faithful, worthy of their trust in this task. Among the Christian names of interpreters, some of the names are also highly significant. This is the case, for example, of Pere de Bonia, a merchant who, at the beginning of the 15th century, was based in Granada with great mercantile interests and very well introduced and connect with the Nasrid court, where obviously he had learned Arabic and mastered it enough to be able to interrogate the new arrived Muslim captives in Valencia. Nevertheless, when we leave aside the personal context and the oral communication between Christians and Muslims and move to the written diplomatic context, things become more complicated. In the late medieval Western Mediterranean, the letters that usually were sent by Islamic powers to the Christian ones were usually written in Arabic. In the archives of the Crown of Aragon in Barcelona, nearly 200 letters in Arabic received from the Muslim rulers of Granada, North Africa, and Egypt are preserved. They constitute the largest extant collection of Arabic political diplomatic documents from the medieval Western Mediterranean. As a result of being written in Arabic, they needed to be translated into a Romance language in order to be understood by the Christian rulers. In 1438, a letter from the Republic of Genoa to the King of Granada states, as you can see in the slide, that Arabic letters were received, but that due to lack of translator, they could not be understood. Such problems do not seem to have existed in the Crown of Aragon, which was more used than Genoa to regularly receiving Arabic letters and maintaining regular and intense diplomatic contacts with Western Islam. Indeed, a set of contemporary Romance translations of these Arabic documents are also preserved in the archives. So you have some examples of them in the slide. An unavoidable question is, of course, who was able to ensure the fluidity of the written communication between the Islamic and the Christian powers by combining a true command of reading Arabic with writing in Latin script, or in other words, by whom, how, how and where the letters were translated. When truces and treaties with Islamic powers were signed, the documents included as well a double version of the final agreements. You have in the screen 3 different examples preserved in the archives of the Crown of Aragon. In these cases, we know at least that the translations of truces and treaties were done in place where they received the final ratification of the rulers. Either the Romance or Latin text was written in the Crown of Aragon and sent with the other half of the document in blank to the Islamic rulers in order they include the Arabic translation, or the document with the written Arabic part was sent to the Crown of Aragon with the other half of the document in blank in order to include the Romance or Latin translation. Although when ambassadors didn't speak Arabic, an oral interpreter, a dragoman, was recruited and participated in the embassies, we do not know exactly by whom the written translations of the treaties and truces were effectively done. The translators' reliability and trustworthiness were, of course, essential issues, and the translation could not be left in the hands of the other party. We do not know either whether the Islamic and Christian rulers had always in their courtly and chancellery circles handy people able to do accurate translations. While we have no real clues regarding the official translations or translators of truces and treaties, some indications arise in turn occasionally regarding the preserved contemporary Romance translations of the Arabic, the ones I have shown previously. At least in the case of the Iberian Christian rulers, it seems that the letters in Arabic could have been translated both in Islamic and in Christian lands. For example, in 1356, the representative of the Catalan Aragonese king in Majorca sent him a letter received in Arabic from the king of Fez, together with its translation done in Majorca. In 1435, the king Alphonse the Magnanimous, the king of Aragon, who at the time was in Sicily, requested a translation into Romance of an Arabic letter he had received from the king of Granada, which he sent back then to the general bailiff of the kingdom of Valencia once translated. While during the negotiation of the Castilian-Granadan truce of 1439, the Castilians entrusted a Jew from the city of Granada with some translations from Arabic into Romance. However, these references are exceptional, and we do not know where and by whom the majority of the Arabic translations into Romance were done. It is difficult to speculate concerning the identity and the skills of the translators, given that one may comprehend a language without being able to read and write in it. And this is particularly true of Arabic for Romance language speakers, as well as particularly true of Roman languages for Arabic speakers. As I have already mentioned and shown, many diplomatic agents and Christian merchants in Islamic lands were undoubtedly able to speak and to understand oral Arabic, but not to read, not to write in it. And Christian rulers needed the translations of written Arabic to be as accurate and faithful as possible with respect to the content of the originals in order to understand them exactly and to be sure of their meaning. Otherwise, the translation would not have been useful in diplomatic relations. While the identities of the oral mediators rarely appear in the written sources, the authors of these utilitarian Romance translations of Arabic letters preserved in the archives are almost completely invisible. Usually, the contemporary Romance translations of the Arabic letters give no clues regarding the identity of the translators. To some extent, this invisibility of the translators is understandable because the authors of the written translations were supposed to be merely quick and anonymous transmitters of the content of the letters. Like the oral translations, the written Romance diplomatic translations were destined to be ephemeral, because after understanding the content of the letters and after answering them, the translations lost their utility and were of no further importance. Nevertheless, on certain special occasions, some of the translators and some of their translation techniques come to light because of the translators' need to explain themselves, just as they do nowadays, the translators, through explanatory footnotes. And these few examples shed some light on them and their translation practices. One example is that of the anonymous translator, who translated an Arabic letter sent by the Sultan of Damascus to James II, the king of the Crown of Aragon, in 1330. This person, who translated the letter into Castilian, includes a statement just before the translation, which is valuable because of the discussion regarding the complexity involved in the translation from Mamluk diplomatic Arabic into a Romance language. He who translated this letter says that anyone who sees this letter should not worry if they find it hard to understand, for the Arabic in it is a special language. It has been created with a great mastery, using poetic verbs of great subtlety according to the rules of Arabic grammar. But in many places, the verbs could not be translated literally because there are no such equivalent verbs in Romance, and I had to translate the sense. In this quotation, the anonymous translator points out that the original document in Arabic he is about to translate is not only written in verse, but also that whoever wrote it had a great mastery of Arabic grammar, and that as a consequence, its translation was very complex. The Romance translator wants to justify himself and to apologize because he has often not been able to translate the Arabic verbs literally and found himself obliged to translate only what he thought was the intended meaning of the words. In this case, due to the added complexity of the original text written in verse, the Romance translator makes a personal statement so that he can justify or demonstrate that although the maxim traductore, traditore, translator, traitor, might be true with regard to the literal meaning of the words, it does not have to be in regards to the intentions of a good translator. What mattered the most was to transmit, in the diplomatic relation, what mattered the most was to transmit the content and the intention of the letters, not to translate the exact words literally. This becomes obvious when we compare the contemporary late medieval translations of the Arabic letters into Romance housed in the archives of the Crown of Aragon with the 20th century translations of the same Arabic letters published by modern scholars. The content is, of course, the same, but the translations are worlds apart in terms of cultural translation and cultural transmission. While in the publication of 1940, the Arabic philologists took care to guarantee literal and technically perfect translations, the medieval translators, as stated in the above-mentioned quotation, were not worried about the literality of the words, but mostly about how to facilitate a clear understanding of the content of the letters. Therefore, medieval translations are shorter and straightforward and always avoid the dense Arabic diplomatic rhetoric kept in the modern translation of the Arabic letters to benefit the simplicity, intelligibility, and precision of the text. In any case, the statement of James II's translator also shows that medieval diplomatic translators were fully aware that what were they doing was pure intercultural mediation and communication, and that they possessed significant power to shape and distort opinions and contents. This also highlights the fact that they were cultural brokers and the level of trust their patrons must have had in them. The importance of such fidelity is made clear in another document where we again briefly glimpse the Romance translator. In this case, he clearly positions himself through a personal comment in favor of the Christian power, the King of the Crown of Aragon, James II, again, who he makes clear is his patron. The translator denounces what he considers, with evident authority, a clear manipulation of the information by a missive of the Nasrid king, Ismail I. This is a Catalan translation of a letter dated 1316, whose translator identifies himself as Pere Robert, interpreter of James II. The letter from the King of Granada, Ismail I, was in reply to a claim which James II had presented to him with respect to the capture of booty and people on the frontier of Granada. Ismail insisted that James II's claim was inappropriate and argued that the Granadans had attacked the subjects of the Crown of Aragon as a reprisal for attacks carried out previously by the latter. After concluding the translation into Catalan of the King of Granada's Arabic letter, Pere Robert added, "No, sir, I, Pere Robert, your dragoman, want to certify to you that you can justly ask for the cattle and the people that the Granadan subject seized to be returned, because before the cattle was captured by the Granadan subjects, the Granadan subjects had not been injured by yours." In addition, when Ismail I was raised as a king in Granada, a general letter was issued to all your merchants and some other people of yours, guaranteeing that they would be safe and secure when entering, exiting, and while being in his land with merchandise and other things. According to Pere Robert, what the King of Granada said in the letter that he had been translating was not true. Pere Robert asserts that the Granadan ruler was lying, and as a consequence that his Granadan subjects did not legally attack the Catalan Aragonese ones. Pere Robert's demonstration of fidelity and his sense of duty towards the Christian king are therefore quite clear. And it is also obvious that if the translator had been someone else who had simply limited himself to translating mechanically, or who was unfamiliar with the situation, or had not felt morally obliged to or supportive of the Catalan-Aragonese king, the interpretation of the letter and the resolution of the incident could have been quite different. Similarly, a note added in the margin of an Arabic letter sent from Fez to the Catalan-Aragonese king in 1358 is significant. It deals with the signing of a peace treaty. It clearly asserts that the translation of 4 letters about the truce negotiation could not be given to Muslim translators because on these matters they were not to be trusted. The king states that the translations needed to be done by a Jewish translator such as Magister Benveniste. The king orders that you have, this is a quotation, the king orders that you have these 4 letters rewritten, that is translated from Arabic into our Romance language by Magister Benveniste, Jew, or by another Jew, because we have to beware of Saracens. Therefore, we realize that although Mudejars often acted as oral interpreters, Christian authorities did not trust them in the case of written translations, as evident in the explicit exclusion of Muslims in the above statement. Indeed, apart from this mention of Magister Benveniste and some other references to Jewish translators of Arabic letters into Romance, to date, I have been able to document only Christians like Pere Robert as translators, working as translators of written Arabic correspondence into Romance. Therefore, everything seems to indicate that, in fact, the Crown of Aragon only fully trusted the loyalty of its Christian subjects, or at least of its non-Muslim subjects, if we also consider Jews, to do the written translations of what we might call highly sensitive information. The question then is whether these Christian subjects of the Crown of Aragon, like Pere Robert, had learned and were able to read written Arabic, and if this was the case, how had they learned it? The lack of information prevents us from finding clear and specific answers. The contemporary Romance translations are the result of their translators' linguistic skills and translation practices. But apart from the Jewish translators, we do not have, we do not have evidence of or specific examples of the religious background, the identity and sociocultural identity of the Arabic Romance translators of written documents. That what is clear, of course, is that they had to be cross-cultural figures. However, it is difficult to know if they had achieved the same level of written linguistic competence in both languages, and if they had, how they managed to achieve it. Some examples coming from the correspondence from Granada to the Crown of Aragon provide clues that can help answer these questions. Not answers, but at least some clues. Based on the sources preserved in the Catalan-Aragonese Chancellery archives, and in addition to the contemporary medieval Romance translations of the Arabic letters, we can also identify another and even more interesting practice: Granada's production and sending of official letters written in Romance that the Christian rulers, therefore, did not need to translate. In Granada, this was a practice that from the end of the 13th century and in the 14th and 15th centuries coexisted with the production and sending of letters in Arabic. As you can see in the slide, the letters are written on dyed red paper that was a distinctive feature of the Nasrid chancellery. They are in fact dark pink, but both Castilian and Catalan sources refer to them always as red letters from Granada. Therefore, these Romance letters are technically Arabic in so much as they were created by the Islamic chancellery of Granada and validated by the Nasrid kings through the addition of their alama in Arabic. That's beside the arrow. The alama means that the writing of the letter had been personally supervised and the text was approved by the Nasrid king. The majority of these Arabic letters written in Romance are written in Castilian and have a distinctive Castilian paleographic style, which suggests that the scribes were trained or at least influenced by Castilian writing practices. Nevertheless, almost nothing is known about them, whether they were Granadan or Castilian, or in what circumstances that the documents might have been written. In fact, the scant information regarding the identity of the Romance writers in the Nasrid chancellery does not allow us to speculate about their identities, as we only have a record of one writer of apparently Christian origin, one of Jewish, and another who was possibly a Mudejars. However, two Granadan letters written in Catalan and in a clear paleographic Catalan Aragonese style. I wonder if you can appreciate in the slide the difference between the first letter I show you, which was in Castilian and in paleographical Castilian. If you can differentiate it with the other one, which is written in Catalan and with a different, clearly with a different paleography. So these two Catalan letters, these two Granadan letters written in Catalan and in a clear paleographic Catalan style offer a practical example of the procedures that may have been used by the Granadan chancellery to write letters in Romance and can give us some additional clues about the process or some processes involved in translating Arabic letters into Romance. The two Catalan letters were written by a Valencian captive, Pere Marrades, whose adventures are well known to us. He appears repeatedly in the diplomatic correspondence with Granada in the early 15th century. And while his family in Valencia maintained that he had been forced to renege and stay in Granada, the Nasrid authorities claimed that he had remained in Granada of his own free will. We cannot be certain whether Marrades apostatized, but these two letters in Catalan, written in the Kingdom of Granada, in our city of Malaga, in the chamber of my lord, the King of Granada, by Pere's own hand on behalf of the King of Granada, demonstrate at least that he stayed voluntarily in the Nasrid kingdom, and moreover, that he enjoyed the full confidence of the Granadan king and his court circles. The first of the two letters, the one you have in the slide, was signed personally by Yusuf III of Granada in Latin script, which must have been an exercise of calligraphic copying on the part of the Granadan king. He wrote, you can see it, Rex Yusef in Latin script. The other letter is signed by Marradas himself, who adds also in his own hand in Arabic, Muhalis, meaning that it is he who has sent or issued the letter. We even notice, in this case, Marradas' clearly unsure and shaky hand, signifying that he was unused to Arabic writing, and that almost certainly he just copied the Arabic calligraphy, as did King Yusuf III, signing the other letter in Latin script. Marradas' explanation allows us to understand how at least these two letters were actually written. The King of Granada dictated to Pere Marradas in spoken Arabic what to write, while Marradas put it down on paper in Romance. Marradas justifies this procedure by making clear that the King of Granada wanted to be better understood. The most important thing is perhaps the king's statement that the whole process of mediated writing and translation was chosen so that the recipient of the letter, a Valencian knight, could better understand and read it directly, without the need of intermediaries. The king undoubtedly wanted to avoid an unreliable translation in case the letter was written in Arabic. All this makes it clear that, renegade or not, Marradas eventually became someone extremely close to the Nasrid ruler. The fact that the king used this process of writing and translating the letters without having means to control their content signifies that the translator enjoyed the full confidence of the Sultan and his court circles, who were unable to check if Marradas was translating and writing precisely what was dictated to him. At the same time, this case also seems to indicate that the writing of Arabic letters in Romance must have often been entrusted to Castilian or Catalan, in this case, literate Arabic speakers established in Granada or with close links to the Sultanate. These Castilian or Catalan literate speakers had not only mastered oral Arabic and Roman script, but also enjoyed the full confidence of the Islamic authorities. Marradas' example does not mean, of course, that the writers of the Arabic letters in Romance, and moreover the Arabic Romance translators, were or had been captives or renegades. In fact, Marradas could have been an exception, since because of their Christian origins, captives and renegades were not considered loyal and trustworthy, even though they might have had mastered both Arabic and written Romance. Nevertheless, when referring to these examples of Arabic correspondence written in Romance or to the Romance translations of Arabic correspondence, it becomes clear that we are dealing with intertwined examples of interculturality and processes of entanglement whose extraordinary value as sources of information about cultural exchange and brokerage, as well as about some features of the medieval Islamic world, had been completely ignored. The Arabic letters written in Romance are clear and unique examples of hybridization, just like the signature in Latin characters of the King of Granada, Yusuf III, or the Arabic written Muhalis of Pere Marrada's Shaykhi hand. To conclude, all these examples demonstrate different levels of knowledge and different levels of understanding the oral and written languages. They also confirm that the oral and written Arabic Romance translators had to be almost compulsory cross-cultural characters. Transverse figures, often almost anonymous, who in short, though they may have come, belonged to, and even been active in one of the two societies, were ambidextrous, and therefore able to do well in the two worlds. We can borrow from Robert Barnes the concept of parallel societies to refer to the Islamic and Christian Mediterranean worlds. But they were also at the same time frontier societies. And like any other frontier situation, despite the religious, cultural, and linguistic differences and the theoretical ideological divide between Christians and Muslims, the frontier hinge generated shared spaces, shared groups, and shared individuals. And as a consequence, cultural mediators or cultural brokers able to move between these neighboring worlds who put them in contact and who ensured their effective communication. Thank you very much.